We're gathering now for our final session, final insights and wrap up. And we are very fortunate to have for our final keynote in conversation our co-founder and CEO Paul van Zyl in conversation with Dan McGrail, the CEO of RenewableUK. Thank you.
So, for the purpose of this, your remarks are going to be in your capacity as the holder of your current job. Yeah. But I think for full disclosure and for relevance, you should let the audience know what your next job will be starting on Monday.
It sounds like a Tonight Matthew moment of, No, so as of Monday, I'm going to be taking on the job of Chief Executive of GB Energy, or Great British Energy, which is obviously an important part of the government's mission for transforming the UK's energy system into and the so-called clean energy superpower. So I've been selected to do that for at least the next 6 months, and I think for anyone who works in the energy industry or who works in the climate movement, there's been a lot of questions about what GB Energy is, what's its role in the industry, and it's kind of my job to figure out the answer to that. So hopefully, wish me luck.
You should do a little inbox or a message box so this audience can give you some suggestions.
Believe me, my LinkedIn inbound in mails is well, I'm behind on that, shall we say? So.
Okay, so you've played a really, really important role in stewarding the rollout of renewables in this country. And this country is, in some ways, with all its flaws and warts, a real poster child for how you decarbonize and how you roll out renewables. And so I want to have a conversation with you, both in terms of what you've done, but also obviously what you're going to do, about how insurance has enabled renewables, what insurance might or could do differently or could have done differently, and as we seek to accelerate the rollout of renewables, which is going to be essential in our path to net zero, from your vantage point, what would be the optimal role of the industry? So that's our setting for what we want to talk about. So why don't we start with the beginning? What role has it played in your experience, and just set the scene for the audience?
Okay, so first of all, just a word on Renewable UK and my current role. So Renewable UK is a trade association. We represent about 500 companies who are developers, owners, operators of predominantly wind farms. We work very, very closely with the solar industry as well, but also all of the supply chain and the people who make the technology, and that kind of. That's probably one of the areas where this is really important to talk about. The journey, and you're right in what you say. I mean, our progress as a country, it's not something we're not particularly good at, really, as patting ourselves on the back for the things that we have accomplished. But last year, renewable energy was about 50%, or just under 50% of our energy, if we take into account all of the various different sources. And in 2014, about 40% of our energy was coming from coal. And last year, we closed the last coal-fired power station in Britain. And believe me, it's not often that politicians turn up in a high-vis and a hard hat to close something, but they actually did for that. And it is a remarkable milestone. And that has been achieved largely through, on one hand, proving that the technology works, and ultimately. We're still on a journey in terms of persuading the public of that, but largely in terms of persuading policymakers, that has largely been accomplished, as you can see now from having the clean energy mission that the government has, but also by sort of a relentless focus on cost reduction. And in particular, my specialism is offshore wind. I was in one of the technology companies, Siemens, in 2010, when we were trying to work out how to get the cost out. And at that point, just to put a number on it, a megawatt hour of electricity from an offshore wind farm was about £150, when the price out of a coal-fired power station was maybe £40. So we had a very clear strategy called Beat Coal. and it was about really micromanaging how we would get down to that £40 a megawatt hour within a decade. And we did it in less than a decade in the end. But a big part of it was technology, unquestionably, and jumping through the various different hoops of scaling up the technology and making turbines bigger and, you know, reducing the amount of balance of plant and equipment that you needed, but also increasing confidence in the financial institutions that could bring the cost of capital down, but also making the projects more insurable was an absolutely essential part of it. And so, you know, now today, you know, electricity, you know, renewable electricity is the cheapest form of energy, and that simply would not have happened without the sort of convergence of all of those different elements of technology, of cost of capital, and of insurance playing its part as well. Where we are today, and I suppose, you know, to come to what could we have done better, is that I think, you know, we run an insurance event as Renewable UK, and I think, you know, I look at where do we have the biggest insurance claims in our industry, and it's kind of a boring technical point, but fundamentally it's some cables, right? And that's quite a boring thing, but ultimately it's a piece of technology which isn't particularly mature, it isn't particularly new or novel. It's a cable that sits under the sea. And no one really anticipated the fact that these would be the problems. But of course, the consequence of something as simple as a cable failing is that the wind farm doesn't work. And so, you know, where we can do more is actually how can we target our innovation, how can we target our research and development based around actually where the sort of the pain points are within the insurance sector, and how that can help in future bring costs down even further. So that's one element. And I suppose, do you want me to talk a little about the future, or yeah? So I suppose one of the things and the interesting points is that if you look at where we've got to today, we're about, you know, say 40% of our electricity supply. The bit that I always try to contextualize in all of this is that if you think about energy as opposed to electricity consumption today is about 20% of the energy that we consume as a country, and about the other 40% is currently heat, which is mainly delivered by gas, and then the other 40% is transport, which is mainly delivered by, you know, hydrocarbons. So in order to get to net zero, then we need to turn that other 80% into electricity. And that is largely the strategy that we have as a country. So we need to keep building renewables, and we need to keep going well beyond. So the 50% number is a bit of a red herring, really. Actually, we've got to keep growing our electricity system, which means that we're going to put more and more strains on where we can do things and how we do things. So one of the great examples of the challenges that we have in wind at the moment in particular is that we need to work out how to take wind farms further away from the shore, which means into deeper and deeper water, which means probably in most cases making wind turbines float, right? And that is actually a convergence of fairly mature technologies. A wind turbine is a mature technology, and in the oil and gas industry we've been making things float for many, many years. So how can we work together to make those types of applications of renewable technology to be as insurable as quickly as possible? How can we work with government policymakers to help bring the insurance industry in that? What do people need to see to be able to increase confidence at a more rapid pace than perhaps we did last time? Because we really don't have time to take a breath and figure all of this stuff out. We've got to work on a continual deployment of renewables, and by the end of this decade, really, we will have more or less run out of spaces where we can build renewables either terrestrially or offshore within easy to engineer places. We need to go into increasingly more complex territories, and that's where we need to intensify our collaboration.
So let's take your case study of floating offshore wind, and let's say that it's a nascent technology or a model that hasn't yet been fully deployed or scaled, and therefore there's higher risk in it than the kinds of either onshore wind or immediate, you know, offshore wind that's not floating. What would insurance companies have to do to de-risk that or enable the rollout of those nascent technologies that they would not be prepared to do now. And put differently, if they sit back and say, well, wonderful, Dan, roll that out for 5 years. Once you've got the models and you've shown this works, and then I'll underwrite it, that sounds good because that's what we do. And you're going, we need you to be more adventurous or increase risk or come along with us more. And we've spoken a lot in this conference about taking on more risk because we live in a more risky world and we also have a clock that's ticking. Yeah. So what would that look like? Because underwriters go, well, either I'm going to have to increase the price or I'm going to lose money. So,
well, I think there is a point about risk and actually the entrepreneurial nature of this. I mean, one of the, and again, we take the floating wind example, which is just because we've started with it. One of the beauties of that technology is it takes what has previously been the domain of nations with shallow seabeds and fairly easy places to engineer and takes it into a much more global context. So the pipeline for that technology is huge in terms of leased space around the world, but actually the deployment to date isn't very big. So actually, if we can start to engineer our way through this quickly in the UK and become a world leader, and given our prowess in the financial services sector anyway, then the market that we open up internationally is enormous for this particular technology. Offshore wind was basically Northern Europe and parts of China, frankly, whereas this, if we can successfully deploy it, becomes a global opportunity, which we absolutely should, as Britain, grab with both hands. I think really starting to work much more intensively around the innovation that's happening. I almost sort of resist language like nascent technology, because what we're actually talking about is a nascent application of existing technologies. And so really working together to understand exactly what the technical concerns are, or how do we mitigate that as an industry, understanding more about the innovation, sharing data, actually something that we could do better as an industry with the insurance sector and just in general with each other, is how are assets performing, what are the issues that we're encountering, and how can we overcome them technically and commercially is an important part of that roadmap.
Okay, let's pivot a little bit to talk about a topic you and I have discussed, which is onshore wind, solar. When you do major installations and you're doing it on crowded space, on the ground, in nature, increasingly the renewables industry is also having to think about biodiversity loss and conversely net gain.
Yeah.
And it has to be a buyer of biodiversity credits, or it has to think about this in a more active way, which is sort of paradoxical, because in one way, like, I'm fine if you're going to develop a golf course or a hotel, you should definitely doing, but renewables doing it is sort of, there's a strange sort of question there. And so you've spoken a little bit about, like, there's an insurance play here as well, and tell us a little bit about your thinking about that.
Well, I guess the first thing, and I suppose it's just an observation for me, is on the industry, is that the bar that we are held to, arguably because we are operating in climate change, is incredibly high. So the expectations on renewable energy projects, terrestrially or offshore, is incredibly high in terms of its the expectations for environmental mitigation and compensation, and ultimately the companies that are involved in the industry do genuinely want to demonstrate environmental net gain, biodiversity net gain as part of their projects. So we're doing a huge amount as an industry in areas where you wouldn't necessarily think, but peatland restoration as an example is something that is really a topic we work quite strongly on as an industry, particularly in onshore wind in places like Scotland and Wales, where this is an important topic. And clearly, if and I imagine, and this isn't because we've had a pre-conversation about this, but I imagine that when you look at the risk register of most insurance companies, environmental and climate change is a significant threat. And actually, the work that we're doing in renewables is a huge enabler to solving that problem or acting as a mitigation to that problem. So for me, essentially, environmental net gain, biodiversity net gain are considered as costs to renewable energy projects today. They are things that we have to do, but ultimately want to do. But at the same time, is there not an opportunity to flip that round and say, instead of it being just a cost for the project, is it not an opportunity for the insurance sector to be able to play a role in mitigating the overall risks to their own businesses? Equally, I mean, structurally, as an industry, we've gone past the point of being able to mitigate problems for projects at a project level, and we now need to start to look at it at a national level, and that becomes an interesting question in itself. So, I mean, this is most obvious in offshore, where we are, through legislation, setting up something called a marine recovery fund, where developers will invest into that, but that will produce huge. I mean, I know you've been talking today about the creation of the 1,000 new wetlands. I mean, this is an example where actually, as an industry, we're going to also be underpinning and triggering major sort of biodiversity net gain assets that will be a part of the equation going forward in a way that they haven't been in the past. They've just been project by project. Now we're looking at regionally, nationally, and potentially even internationally, how do we do environmental net gain and biodiversity net gain in a much more coordinated way.
So let me ask you about, as renewables become increasingly part of the built environment, increasingly part of major infrastructure, they're not sort of small idiosyncratic projects, they're a core part of national infrastructure. They start becoming at risk, particularly of something we've discussed around flooding. They are at risk at the same time, so you could have, the greatest definition of irony would be for renewables to be washed away by floods. And so in some ways, having you part of a project where we think about how to defend renewables and how you then protect them against floods, and how you put wetlands above them, and how you then sink in revenue streams from wetlands into renewables and create some kind of linkages between them, would be an interesting piece of innovation.
Absolutely, and I think there's a huge appetite for that type of innovation, partly because the sector is looking for new ways to work. And also, I think, being frank, renewables is, we like to talk about it being a mature industry, but the reality is it's still only sort of 15, 20 years old as an industry, moving beyond a sort of a set of projects. But we are building projects now which are in the hundreds, millions, billions, major pieces of infrastructure, which do have their own insurance risks, they have their own set of challenges, and clearly anything that we can do to work together with other sectors that opens up opportunities that first of all help reduce costs, but also help mitigate risks for those assets in and of themselves is an area of exploration that we're up for, and we're very much open for, and we have the structures in place to be able to have those dialogues, both with other industries but also with government.
So Peter Maurer spoke earlier, who serves on the board of Zurich and plays an important role in looking at sustainability in Zurich, and was talking about the percentage of assets invested in renewables by insurers on their own, from their own assets and balance sheets, and was saying that Zurich was committed to about 6% of their assets invested in renewables. Have you found that the insurance industry is being a sufficient source of capital for the rollout of renewables? Is one thing, it's as an insurer and an underwriter, the other is helping to invest and fuel this as an investor.
There are cases where that is the case, but there are. I would say it's not certainly a major component today in terms of acting as an investor. Majority of investment is coming from the institutional funds that we would normally see active in the space, the major household banks. I'm not saying I don't have a percentage in my head of the overall sort of fleet of assets that we have in Britain, but I certainly think that there is scope to do more. And truthfully, the scale of the build out that we're looking at over the next generation. I mean, the number that's being bandied around is about 40 billion a year in the UK alone in renewable energy assets in terms of capital investment. So for the next 5 years at least, and probably continuing at that kind of run rate going into the future. So sources of capital, the portfolio of assets in terms of like risk categories and classes is broadening. There are more high risk assets which we'll see come forward, like we talked about, like floating offshore wind as an emerging application. But equally, you know, things like fixed bottom offshore wind now are very low risk. The construction risks are very low. People understand them. So ultimately, you know, the opportunity for investment from the insurance sector is significant, but also, you know, the competition for capital is probably reducing somewhat because ultimately you've got such a big cake, or we should have such a big cake for people to go after.
So I'm going to ask you a final question, and this is not asking you to say anything in your capacity as your future job, because you haven't started, and I think you're going to want to be artfully quiet for a while as you try and figure it out and set it all up. But just for this audience, because it's 8.7 billion?
8.3.
8.3. So 8.3 billion, it's not a gigantic amount of money in the boards, but it's not a small amount of money. And it's intended to be catalytic and leveraged and to crowd in more capital. And so if you begin to think about all the available sources of capital out there and the ways in which at this really pivotal moment in the UK, you could use this to leverage others, what would be the ideal role that the insurance industry could play as a partner to the government in trying to crowd new capital in?
That's a really good question, and it's probably one I haven't thought about a huge amount. I mean, to be truthful, 8.3 billion in the energy industry is not a huge amount of money. So it has to be leveraged up. It has to be catalytic. And the focus for me of a state-owned energy company has to be to operate in the spaces where private capital, you know, doesn't need that help. So where do I see those spaces today? Well, and you know, speaking here, probably with my RenewableUK hat, just in case there's any journalists in the room, you know, things like long duration energy storage is a big part of the, you know, the future mix. Again, we're talking about pretty established technologies being combined into something which is, you know, a new application. Things like floating wind, other areas where ultimately the risks are not as well known as they are for where private capital can operate. So for me to be successful running an organization which is going to operate in spaces which are you know, a little bit more pre-commercial, with the view to scaling up industries and growing industries, working hand in hand with insurance is going to be really important, because, you know, and that point about risk and that entrepreneurial opportunity, we want, you know, I would see GB Energy as the purpose of this is something to invest, to enable industries to grow that can ultimately be export champions for the UK, that can make a huge contribution beyond these shores as well as on these shores. So to come together to that opportunity, to understand where the entrepreneurial opportunities are and to take more risk is ultimately something that, you know, I think the government is coming forward and taking a risk. So it'd be great if others did as well.
Well, that's an incredibly good note to end on. I know you have to scuttle off up north, but I do think that that's an open invitation. I think that what we've heard a lot today from within the industry is, I think, an authentic commitment and determination to deploy capital, to think about data and its predictive power to be a tool that can meet this moment, and to think about risk in a more thoughtful and creative way, to adjust the way we think about risk. And that's easier said than done, but I think to have that industry a thought partner to you in your new role would be something that I think would be very welcome and would be awesome for you to take up. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you for inviting me. And genuinely, don't be put off by the LinkedIn approaches. I'll be happy to have many conversations once I start next week.
Please contact this man. Thank you very much.